The call came in at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I still have the voicemail. My neighbor Eleanor, 79 years old, retired school teacher, lived alone since her husband passed, was telling me, in a voice that was trying very hard not to sound frightened, that the plow truck had just turned around at the end of her driveway. That the driver had gotten out, made a phone call, and then pulled away without touching a single inch of the road between her house and the main street. There were 14 inches of snow on the ground. More coming. She had a cardiology appointment that morning, the kind you don't reschedule. I stood at my kitchen window in my socks, watching the road, our road, buried under a white wall that didn't care about anybody's property rights. And I thought, I need to understand exactly what just happened. What I found out over the next 72 hours changed the way I understood every interaction I'd had with our HOA board for the previous 4 years. I am not a lawyer. I am not a retired police officer or a former contractor who understood the angles from years of working around them. I am a retired civil engineer who spent 31 years working on municipal infrastructure, water mains, drainage systems, road grading specifications, culvert sizing. I understand, with some precision, how roads work, how they are classified by deed and by jurisdiction, how ownership is documented in county records, and how that documentation becomes the only thing that matters when something goes wrong and two parties are standing in the cold, arguing about who has the right to do what. I've lived on Sycamore Lane for 12 years, long enough to know every household on the road by name and by habit. I know which families have been here since the lane was nothing but gravel and ambition, and which ones arrived after the development grew up around us and started pressing its fences and its HOA newsletters against our tree line. I am, by temperament and by professional formation, the kind of person who writes things down, meeting notes, phone call summaries, dates and amounts and exact words when they seem important enough to preserve. I have kept this habit since my first job out of college, when my supervisor told me that the difference between a documented fact and an undocumented fact is the difference between a tool and a wish. That habit would matter more than I expected it to. Sycamore Lane is a private road. That is not a casual characterization or a matter of neighborhood pride. It is a legal fact recorded in the County Deed Index, in the kind of dry, specific language that makes real estate attorneys comfortable and everyone else's eyes glaze over. The lane measures 4/10 of a mile from the county-maintained road at its eastern entrance to the turnaround loop at its western end, and it serves 6 households. It was established in 1987 by the original developer, who platted the 6 lots and created an access easement for the benefit of all 6 owners, recorded as a shared private right-of-way. The county has never owned it. The county has never plowed it, repaired it, or accepted any maintenance obligation for it. When you drive onto Sycamore Lane, you leave the public road system and enter private property belonging to 6 households collectively. Most people don't pause to consider what that distinction means in practical terms. Private roads and public roads operate under entirely different legal frameworks. A county road comes with a bundle of governmental obligations: maintenance, snow removal, traffic safety standards. A private road carries none of those obligations from any government entity. What it carries instead is whatever the deed says and whatever the owners among themselves decide. The deed for Sycamore Lane said the 6 owners shared access rights equally. It said nothing else about maintenance. That silence had been filled, over 15 years, by agreement. That agreement was what Harlan wanted to displace. Eleanor had lived on the lane for 22 years. She moved in with her husband Gerald when the development was newer and the trees along the lane's edge were shorter. Gerald died of a stroke in the spring of 2019. She drove a 9-year-old Buick that she maintained with meticulous attention and used primarily for her cardiologist appointments, her grocery store, and her church. She had mentioned once, without drama or self-pity, that the lane was her only way in and out. Her lot sits at the far western end, past the turnaround loop, with no other road access. She had raised the road situation at 2 HOA board meetings in the 18 months prior to the blizzard, mentioned it with the specific, polite persistence of someone who understands that being reasonable is not the same as being heard. Each time, she had been thanked for her input by the board president, who was a man named Harlan and who had the particular quality of seeming to listen while actually cataloging your vulnerabilities for later. The board knew about Eleanor's appointment schedule. It had been stated in a public meeting, on the record. That fact would also matter. The Millbrook Terrace HOA was formed 11 years ago, when the surrounding subdivision built out to approximately 240 homes. The formation of that HOA was, for most homeowners in the development, an unremarkable administrative event. The subdivision needed someone to manage the entrance landscaping, the common green spaces, the mailbox cluster near the main road, the community center building, and the modest list of architectural standards that governed what colors you could paint your shutters. The HOA's founding documents, the CC&Rs, were drafted by the developer's attorney and filed with the county. They were thorough in some areas and boilerplate in others, but they contained one provision that was not boilerplate because it had been negotiated specifically by the 6 households on Sycamore Lane before they agreed to be included in the development's boundary. The provision read, in relevant part, private roads serving individual lot clusters within the development boundary and maintained by the lot owners of record are not subject to the association's maintenance authority or access policies. The 6 of us had insisted on that language. 2 of the original 6 had an attorney look at the draft CC&Rs before signing. The language was specific because we had made it specific. The exclusion was not an oversight, not an ambiguity, not a drafting error. It was deliberate. For 7 years after the HOA's formation, this created no friction whatsoever. The HOA did its work on the subdivision. The lane homeowners managed the lane. We occupied the same geographic space with the cordial indifference of neighbors who have divided their responsibilities clearly. We paid HOA dues at a reduced rate, a separate assessment established at founding, reflecting the fact that we used none of the common amenities except the mailbox cluster, and received the HOA's quarterly newsletter and occasional emails about community events we didn't attend. Then Harlan joined the board. He came onto the board as a regular member 8 years ago and was elected president the following year by the kind of uncontested margin that happens when most homeowners treat board elections as things that happen to other people. He was 63, recently retired from a regional insurance company where he had spent 2 decades in claims management and middle administration. He was organized, procedurally fluent, and constitutionally unable to leave a governance gap unfilled. In a different context, these would be unremarkable management qualities. In an HOA board, president with a fixed idea about what the community should look like, they became something else. He had the manner of a man who did his research. The problem was that his research consistently confirmed his existing positions. He read selectively, retained what was useful, and had the institutional confidence of someone who had spent years being the most organized person in every room he occupied. At board meetings, he used a printed agenda, a clicker for his PowerPoint slides, and the particular form of parliamentary precision that sounds like rigor and functions as a method for controlling what gets discussed. The first letter arrived 4 years before the blizzard. It came on HOA letterhead, addressed to all 6 Sycamore Lane homeowners. The subject line read, Private Road Liability Review. The body of the letter, approximately a page and a half, informed us that the board had conducted an insurance review of the development and had identified the private road as a potential liability exposure. It noted that the lane's maintenance was not subject to HOA oversight. It expressed the board's interest in establishing a formalized arrangement for oversight and standards compliance. At the board meeting that November, where the letter was discussed as an agenda item, Harlan said, and I have this in my notes from that evening with a timestamp, that the private road represented, quote, an unmanaged asset within the development footprint that creates exposure for the community as a whole. He said this with the particular certainty of someone who has done enough reading to feel authorized and not enough reading to be accurate. He presented 2 slides. The first showed a map of the development with Sycamore Lane highlighted in orange. The second showed an insurance industry statistic about private road liability claims that was accurate as far as it went and completely inapplicable to our specific legal situation. I wrote down what he said. I noted the time. The 6 homeowners on Sycamore Lane had been sharing road maintenance costs for 15 years under an arrangement that had evolved from handshake to document over that time. It started in the early years as a simple verbal agreement. When the road needed something, the 6 households split the cost equally, and whoever had the most relevant relationship with a contractor took the lead on getting it done. That arrangement worked until one of the original 6 sold their property, and the new owners wanted to understand what they were agreeing to. So, we formalized it, a signed letter among the 6 households specifying equal cost sharing for road maintenance, snow removal, and emergency repairs. We updated it when 2 more properties changed hands, adding signatures, clarifying terms, having it witnessed by a notary the 3rd time because our attorney suggested it would be cleaner. The snow removal portion was handled by Dell. He ran a 2-truck operation and had been plowing the lane for 9 consecutive winters. He knew the lane's specific topography, the drainage slope at the east end, the corner at the midpoint that iced first in a freeze-thaw cycle, the way the turnaround loop at the western end needed 2 full passes to clear properly because of how the trees funneled the wind-drifted snow into the north quadrant of the loop. He charged a flat seasonal rate, split 6 ways, which worked out to less per household than a gym membership neither person uses. What's worth understanding about informal maintenance agreements on private roads is that courts take them more seriously than the parties often realize. When a group of private road owners establishes a consistent, documented pattern of shared maintenance over many years, that pattern creates what the law calls reasonable reliance. Other parties, including service contractors, adjacent property owners, and courts, can reasonably rely on the continuation of that arrangement. Courts have found that long-standing maintenance agreements, even ones that began as oral understandings, carry enforceable weight when one party attempts to unilaterally disrupt them. The length and consistency of the practice matters. 15 years of documented, updated, notarized cost sharing is a significant factual record. We didn't know we were building a legal record when we started. We were just maintaining a road. We responded to Harlan's letter collectively. We thanked the board for its concern about the community. We noted that the CC&Rs explicitly excluded private roads from HOA jurisdiction and attached a copy of the relevant provision. We noted that the lane had active maintenance arrangements in place, documented and current. We suggested this concluded the matter. Harlan's response came at the next board meeting, a motion to amend the HOA's governing documents to include oversight authority over private roads within the development boundary. He framed it as housekeeping, a correction of what he described as a drafting omission in the original CC&Rs. He said the exclusion language had been a mistake by the developer's attorney. A CC&R amendment of this kind required a quorum of the full HOA membership, not just board members present at a meeting. The motion was put to a vote by proxy and in-person attendance over the following 30 days. It failed to reach quorum. Not enough homeowners cared enough to participate, which is the ordinary fate of most HOA governance questions. Harlan said nothing more about it publicly for the next 3 years. He was still board president. He ran without opposition at each annual election, because running without opposition is a strategy as much as a circumstance, and Harlan understood this. But at every meeting I attended, he spoke about landscaping contracts and community center reservations and architectural review timelines. The lane did not come up. I attended those meetings and took my notes and filed them. I watched Harlan chair his meetings with procedural fluency and the specific patience of someone who is not done with something but has decided to wait. I told myself this was my tendency to look for patterns that might not be there. I was probably right to be unsure. I was also right to keep watching. In the early fall, before the winter that would end this way, Dell called me. He had received a letter on HOA letterhead. He read me the key sentence over the phone. The Millbrook Terrace Homeowners Association asserts authority over all common access roads within the development boundary and requests that service contractors operating on those roads register with the association and maintain specific liability coverage riders as required by the association's risk management policies. Dell's voice had the flat quality of a man who runs a small business and has learned to recognize threats to it. He asked me if the HOA actually had this authority. I told him I did not believe so, but that I was going to verify it before I said anything definitive. He said he appreciated that. He also said he needed an answer before his seasonal contracts renewed, because he wasn't going to sign contracts on a road that might put him in the middle of something. I told him I understood. I called the other 5 households that evening. By the end of the week, we had hired an attorney. Our attorney was a real estate attorney in the county seat who had spent 20 years on property disputes in this part of the state. She had the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has seen enough variations of the same argument to recognize which details matter and which ones people think matter because they're upset. She reviewed the CC&Rs, the lane deed, our cost-sharing agreement in its most recent notarized form, and Harlan's letter to Dell. Her assessment took about 40 minutes and was not ambiguous. The HOA had no jurisdiction over Sycamore Lane. The CC&R exclusion was specific, deliberate language that had been negotiated at founding. The letter to Dell misrepresented the HOA's authority. She would draft a response. The letter she sent on our behalf, addressed to the full board, was 3 pages. It cited the specific CC&R provision. It cited the deed. It cited the cost-sharing agreement as evidence of 15 years of uninterrupted, owner-managed maintenance. It requested that the HOA cease making representations to our service contractors about authority it did not possess. It noted that continuing to do so could constitute tortious interference with our contractual relationships. The HOA's response came through their own attorney 3 weeks later. It was a more sophisticated document than Harlan's original letter, but it had the same fundamental problem. It was arguing a position that the underlying documents didn't support. The HOA's counsel contended that the phrase common access roads in the CC&Rs was ambiguous and could be construed to include private roads serving multiple households. He argued that ambiguous governing documents should be interpreted in favor of the governing body's authority. This is not, in general, how courts read HOA governing documents, but it is the kind of argument that takes time and money to defeat. Dell read our attorney's summary of the exchange. He said he understood the legal position. He also said that his insurance carrier had asked him a question about whether any roads he serviced were the subject of active legal correspondence, and that he had answered honestly, and that the answer had made his carrier uncomfortable. He said he was going to continue service for the current season, but that he needed the situation resolved before next fall's contracts. We told him we intended to resolve it. We did not yet know what resolution would require. That fall, we managed the road ourselves between the 6 households in a rotation we had never needed before. Tom kept a bag of calcium chloride in his garage and walked the lane after each frost. Pete's truck blade handled accumulations under 3 inches. We were not inefficient about it. Engineers, contractors, and retired military people generally are not, but it introduced uncertainty into a system that had previously run on reliability. Dell had been reliable. The rotation was improvised. Improvised systems break at the worst moments. All of us understood this without naming it. The following fall, Harlan ran for board president again. He won by 8 votes over a candidate who had filed late and campaigned primarily by email. His first act as returning president was to reintroduce the Sycamore Lane question, this time under a different legal theory. The new argument was safety jurisdiction. Harlan had consulted with the HOA's attorney and returned with a claim that Sycamore Lane functioned as a secondary fire access route for a portion of the development, specifically for the lots whose rear property lines abutted the community green space to the north of the lane. Because fire access fell under the board's safety authority, Harlan argued, the lane was subject to HOA maintenance standards regardless of what the CC&Rs said about general road jurisdiction. He had a section of the county fire code to support this. The section required that fire access lanes serving multifamily residential structures be maintained to specific width and surface standards. The section applied to apartment complexes and multifamily housing developments. It did not apply to single-family private roads. Harlan did not make this distinction at the board meeting where he presented the argument. What Harlan was attempting is a move that HOA boards occasionally make when their governing documents don't give them the authority they want. Finding an external regulatory hook, safety, fire code, environmental standards, and using it to claim jurisdiction that the CC&Rs don't provide. Courts are generally skeptical of this approach when the underlying regulatory claim is pretextual or misapplied. But skepticism takes a court, and a court takes time, and time costs legal fees, and that pressure is its own form of leverage. Harlan had been in insurance long enough to understand the economics of dispute resolution. I attended that board meeting. It was held in the community center's conference room, fluorescent tube lighting that buzzed faintly at a frequency most people didn't consciously register. But that made everyone slightly more irritable over time. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing the board's table, a podium that came to mid-chest on anyone over 5'8". The coffee was from a machine in the hallway and had the character of coffee that has been warm for too long. I sat in the 3rd row and wrote down what was said. What struck me, sitting there, was not the argument itself, which was legally thin and practically obvious to anyone who had read the fire code provision in its complete context, but the confidence of its delivery. Harlan was not bluffing. He genuinely believed he was right. He had found a provision, had his attorney examine it, received some form of confirmation that it was at least arguable, and concluded that arguable was the same as correct. This is a specific cognitive error I had seen in project management throughout my career, treating the absence of immediate refutation as evidence of correctness. Nobody in that room had the fire code text in front of them. Nobody could produce the counter-argument on the spot. In that vacuum, Harlan's certainty filled the space and functioned as authority. Harlan presented for 22 minutes. He had a slide deck. He used the word safety 11 times, which I counted because I was writing things down. He used the phrase community-wide exposure 4 times. He cited the fire code provision. When he opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand and noted that the fire code provision he had cited applied to multifamily residential structures, not single-family private roads. He said the board's legal counsel had reviewed the provision and found it applicable in this context. I asked whether counsel had issued a written opinion we could review. He said that was an internal document. The meeting moved to the next item. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Dell received a second letter. This one bore the HOA attorney's letterhead. It was formally structured with numbered paragraphs and citations. It identified the HOA's claimed safety jurisdiction, cited the fire code provision by number, and instructed Dell to cease providing snow removal services on Sycamore Lane until the jurisdictional question was resolved through the board's administrative process. It stated that continuing to provide services during a period of active jurisdictional dispute could expose Dell's business to liability. Dell called me the same afternoon he received it. I could hear the sound of his shop in the background, metal on concrete, the idle of a diesel engine. His voice had the quality of a decision already made, being explained rather than discussed. He said he had talked to his insurance agent. He said the agent had advised him that servicing a road, described in legal correspondence as jurisdictionally disputed, could affect his coverage. He said he was a 2-truck operation. He said he didn't have an attorney to sort through this for him. He said he was suspending service on the lane until the matter was resolved, and he was genuinely sorry about it. I told him I understood his position. I did. I also knew that the cease and desist had no legal force over him. The HOA had no authority to issue binding instructions to a contractor operating under our agreement, but telling Dell that, however true, was not going to change what his insurance agent had said or what his business calculus required. The letter had worked regardless of its legal legitimacy. That is a thing Harlan understood and we had underestimated. Our attorney recommended filing a declaratory judgment action. A declaratory action is a specific type of lawsuit that asks the court to definitively state the legal rights of the parties before a harm fully occurs. It's a mechanism for forcing legal clarity when one party is exercising claimed authority they may not actually have, and the other party needs an authoritative resolution. We filed in October. The filing named the HOA as respondent and asked the court to confirm 3 things: that Sycamore Lane was exclusively under the maintenance authority of the 6 homeowners, that the HOA's CC and Rs excluded the road from its jurisdiction, and that the HOA's communications to Dell constituted misrepresentation of authority that had caused us material harm through loss of contracted services. The first hearing was scheduled for February 12th. The HOA was served in late October. Harlan's response, delivered through counsel, was not to prepare a defense, but to escalate. 10 days after being served, he sent a second cease-and-desist letter to Dell. This one referenced the pending litigation explicitly, noting that Dell's services were being performed on a road subject to active legal dispute, and that continuing to provide those services during litigation created potential liability exposure for his business. The letter was legally thin. It was practically effective. Dell sent us an email the following week saying he was withdrawing from his seasonal contract entirely, effective immediately, and that he hoped the matter was resolved soon. He thanked us for the years of business. He said he hoped we understood. November brought the first snow of the season, 4 inches, arriving on a Tuesday night, sitting on the lane and everyone's driveways by Wednesday morning. Without Dell, the lane stayed covered. I cleared my own driveway. My neighbor Pete, a retired general contractor who lived across from me, cleared approximately 1/3 of the lane's length with the plow blade on his truck, the one he'd bought for a hunting cabin up north and rarely used in the subdivision. The rest of the lane sat under its 4 inches. Eleanor's car was buried past its door handles. Pete's son Marcus, who was 17 and the particular kind of teenager who does things without being asked, walked down to Eleanor's end of the lane after school with a shovel. He worked for an hour and 40 minutes. He cleared her driveway, her walkway, and the section of lane immediately in front of her property. When he finished, Eleanor came to the door. She was wearing a coat over her house dress. She stood at the door and thanked him in the way that people thank someone when they have been genuinely, specifically helped, and they want that to be understood clearly. She had made hot chocolate. He sat at her kitchen table and drank it. The six of us exchanged texts that evening. The tone was practical, not alarmed. Pete said we needed a plan for the rest of the season. We agreed to meet Saturday. We talked about alternatives. Another plow contractor, a rotational system among the households that had their own equipment, a combination. We were problem-solving people. Problems got solved. What I did not mention at that Saturday meeting was something I had found 2 months earlier while doing research for the declaratory action, reviewing plat maps, easement documents, and the HOA's own records as our attorney had requested. Sycamore Lane's 6 households were the obvious and only residential users of the lane, but the lane was also the sole access route for the driveways of 3 homes that sat at the lane's midpoint and southern end. These 3 homes had rear lot lines that abutted the HOA community green space, but their driveway access, their only vehicular access, was off Sycamore Lane. They were not technically on Sycamore Lane in the deed sense. They were HOA members with standard HOA assessments. But their driveways opened onto our road. 2 of those 3 homes belonged to current HOA board members. The third belonged to Harlan. Harlan's Amazon deliveries came down Sycamore Lane, his grocery delivery service, his propane truck, which made a run every 6 weeks, his pharmacy deliveries. Every vehicle-based service he received at his home traveled 4/10 of a mile on the road he had instructed our contractor not to service. If the lane was impassable to service vehicles, it was impassable to his service vehicles. I wrote this in my notes on October 14th. I dated the entry precisely. I put it in the folder. I said nothing about it to the other 5 households, or to our attorney, or to anyone. I waited. I am, as I said, a patient kind of person. The blizzard watch was posted by the National Weather Service on Thursday afternoon. The forecast was specific, 18 to 24 inches over a 30-hour window beginning Friday night. High winds through Saturday morning, significant drifting in open areas, wind chill values well below 0. The kind of forecast that empties grocery shelves and fills gas tanks and makes the evening news in the tone of voice, reserved for things that are genuinely serious. Thursday evening I called Dell. He did not answer. I left a voicemail explaining the forecast, noting the expected accumulation, and asking whether there was any possibility of emergency service given the circumstances. I told him we had a medically vulnerable resident whose ability to leave the lane was not theoretical. He did not return the call. Friday at 2:30 p.m., I sent an email to the HOA board, addressed to Harlan by name, copied to the 2 other active board members. The email was brief and factual. It noted the weather forecast. It noted that Sycamore Lane had no contracted snow removal service due to the HOA's correspondence with our former contractor. It asked for written clarification. Did the board intend to arrange alternative snow removal service for the lane under its claimed safety jurisdiction? Or was it releasing the 6 homeowners to seek their own service despite the outstanding cease and desist? I noted that at least 1 lane resident had a scheduled medical appointment on Saturday morning. By 9 p.m. or Friday, I had received no reply. Not an acknowledgement, not an out of office, nothing. I checked the weather service radar at 9:30. The storm system was tracking exactly as forecast. Eleanor called at 8:30 Friday evening. She had spoken with her daughter, who lived 40 minutes south, and had offered to come if the road was passable. The appointment was at 8:15 a.m. A follow-up from a procedure she'd had in October with her cardiologist, specifically requesting that she not delay or reschedule. She asked me, quietly, whether I thought the road would be clear in the morning. I told her that 6 people were going to make certain of it and that she should be ready at 6:15. There was a pause on the line. She said, "I appreciate that." Then she asked how much snow they were saying now. I told her the current number was 22 inches. She said, "Goodness." Then she thanked me and said goodnight. The snow started at 11:40 p.m. Friday. I was still awake at my desk, not watching for it, but when it began I became aware of the change in the quality of the light from the window. The amber porch lamp across the lane caught the falling flakes and held them for a fraction of a second each so that the air appeared briefly and continuously populated by small bright points that disappeared before you could focus on them. It fell without wind at first, straight down, with the particular density of a storm that intends to stay. By 1 a.m. there were 5 inches on the lane's surface. By 2 a.m. the gravel was fully submerged. The turnaround loop at the western end, which I could see from my upstairs window if I stood at the right angle, had become a smooth, undifferentiated white field. The tree line on the north side was bending slightly. The wind had arrived. I went to bed at 2:15 and slept badly. The voicemail notification arrived at 6:47 a.m. I heard the chime and was fully awake before I finished listening. Eleanor's voice was measured and careful, which I recognized as the sound of someone who has been composing this message for several minutes before placing the call. The plow truck had come. She had seen its headlights from her bedroom window, the slow amber rotation of the caution light on its cab, the particular way the headlights swept across her ceiling as it turned onto the lane entrance. The truck had moved a short distance onto the lane, stopped. The driver got out. She watched him from her window. She described it precisely. He stood at the lane entrance, looked down the road, took out his phone and made a call. After the call, he stood still for a moment. Then he walked around the truck, got back in, and reversed off the lane. She wanted to know if I knew what had happened. I put on my work boots over my pajama pants. I did not stop for coffee. The temperature outside was 11 degrees, and the wind was coming in from the northwest, moving the dry top layer of snow off the tree branches in short, sharp bursts. I drove my truck to the lane entrance. The plow truck's tire tracks were still clear, two defined lines pressing into the lane entrance for approximately 40 feet, then the wide arc of a commercial vehicle making a three-point reverse. The arc ended at the main road. Beyond the 40 feet of tracks, the lane was unbroken, 20-plus inches of compacted and wind-drifted snow, level surface, no disruption. There was something attached to the post of the private road sign. The sign itself is a small green marker I had installed 10 years ago, mounted on a wooden post, that reads Sycamore Lane, private road in white letters. Attached to the post with two heavy-duty cable ties was a laminated page. I had to walk through knee-high snow to reach it. The lamination was a standard clear plastic sleeve, the kind sold in packs at office supply stores. Inside was a printed copy, full page, laser-printed, clear and legible, of the HOA attorney's November cease-and-desist letter to Dell. The HOA's logo was in the upper left corner. Dell's business name was in the header. The date of the letter was printed clearly. At the bottom of the page, in the white margin below the attorney's signature block, someone had written in black ballpoint pen, in block capital letters, "Road service prohibited pending legal resolution." I stood in the wind and read it twice. The laminate had fogged along its lower edge from the overnight cold. I photographed the sign and the attached document from 3 angles with my phone. I photographed the timestamp visible on my phone's screen in the same frame. I photographed the plow truck's tire tracks, including the full arc of the reversal. I removed the laminated page from the post, cut the cable ties with the pocket knife I keep in my truck's console, and placed it face up on my passenger seat. Then I called Pete. The 6 of us were at the lane entrance by 7:20 a.m. Pete had his pickup with the 42-inch plow blade he'd hauled down from the cabin. Tom, who lived in the second lot from the east end and had spent 22 years in the Army before retiring to do landscaping work, had a 48-inch two-stage snowblower that he ran with the methodical attention of someone for whom equipment maintenance is a form of respect. His wife, Carol, operated a smaller single-stage machine they used for their own driveway. My neighbor, Gail, who was 64 and had completed 3 half marathons in the past 5 years, had a heavy steel scoop shovel and the physical economy of someone who had never wasted a movement. Her husband, Ray, had a matching shovel and an expression that indicated he was ready and did not need to discuss it. I had my truck for hauling displaced snow away from the margins, 2 shovels, and a thermos of coffee that would be empty within 40 minutes. Pete's blade went first, cutting the primary channel down the center of the lane, not a full clear, but a passable lane, 2 tire widths, pushed to the right margin. Tom followed immediately behind with the 2-stage blower working the left margin and throwing the displaced snow into the tree line, his wife running her machine on the right side of Pete's cut. Gail and Ray and I worked the section behind them, widening the cleared channel, breaking up the compressed ridges Pete's blade had left, clearing the areas where wind-drifted snow had built to depths that the blade had not fully penetrated. Before Pete dropped the blade, we stood at the lane entrance for perhaps 90 seconds. Nobody called it a moment or gave it a name. Pete was checking the blade was seated right. Tom was priming his machine. Ray was tightening a bootlace. I was pulling on a second pair of gloves from my coat pocket. The wind came through the lane entrance and lifted the loose snow off the crust in thin, shifting sheets. The lane ran ahead of us, 4/10 of a mile of unbroken white surface, the tree line on both sides heavy with overnight accumulation, the light flat and gray, and not yet fully arrived. Eleanor's porch lamp was visible at the far end, a single amber point in all that white. Pete looked down the lane for a moment, then he dropped the blade. Nobody talked much. The snowblower made conversation essentially impossible, and there wasn't much to say that the shovels weren't saying for us. The work was cold and heavy, and not glamorous. Pete's blade caught the gravel twice at a low spot in the lane's center section, a section we'd flagged for regrading the previous fall and not gotten to sound, and the sound was loud enough to startle even in the wind. Tom's two-stage jammed at the 40-minute mark when it pulled in a section of snow that had ice layered through it. He shut it down, cleared the chute by hand, and had it running again in under 3 minutes. Carol's single-stage machine gave out at the hour mark, a shear pin, which is the machine's designed failure point for overload conditions. Tom replaced it from a kit in his truck's cab in 4 minutes. My lower back began registering its objection at around the 90-minute mark. I noted this and continued. Ray and I hand-shoveled Eleanor's entire turnaround area, the western loop of the lane, which the plow blade couldn't reach without risking the tree roots at the loop's inner edge. It was the deepest accumulation on the lane, 24 inches in places where the wind had done its work. We cleared it in 22 minutes, which is faster than I would have believed possible if I hadn't been doing it. At 9:14 a.m. the lane was passable. One lane, center cleared, 8 feet of width, not perfect, adequate. Eleanor's daughter arrived at 9:22. She drove a Subaru with all-wheel drive and winter tires. I noted both when she pulled in, and she came down the cleared lane at a careful, appropriate speed with her hazard lights on. We were still working on the margins when she reached the turnaround loop. She stopped and rolled down her window. She said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. Eleanor came through her front door 2 minutes later. She was wearing her good coat, the wool one, and her good boots, and she was carrying her purse in both hands in the way she always carried it when she was going somewhere that mattered. She stopped on her porch step. She looked at the lane, the cleared channel running from her turnaround back toward the main road, the 6 of us and our equipment arranged along it. She looked at this for a moment. Then she walked to the car and got in, and her daughter backed carefully down the lane, and they drove to the appointment. Pete looked at the cleared lane. Then he looked at the laminated page, which I had moved from my truck seat to my truck hood. He said, "I want to keep that." I told him he could. We made it back inside before 10 a.m. The lane was passable from that point on. Passable, it turned out, for us. At 1:32 p.m. that afternoon, I was at my desk with a view of the lane entrance, a grocery delivery van, the logo of the service Harlan used, which I recognized because I had seen it on the lane before, pulled to the entrance and stopped. The driver sat for approximately 30 seconds, engine running, then the van reversed and drove away. A package delivery driver arrived at 2:18. He got out of his truck, walked to the lane entrance, stood at the edge of the cleared channel and looked down the lane. He appeared to be consulting his delivery scanner. He walked back to the truck and left. The propane service truck, the same company that serviced Harlan's property, the one I had seen on the lane twice before, arrived at 3:04 p.m. The driver got out and walked to where the laminated signpost had been. He stood there, looked at the lane, looked at the signpost where the cable ties were still visible, got back in his truck and left. Harlan called me at 4:12 p.m. I had not spoken to him directly in 4 months. His voice had the practiced casualness of someone who has decided on a tone and is working to maintain it. He said he was calling to check in and that he'd heard there had been some difficulty with the road that morning. He said he hoped everyone was okay. He asked how things were going on the lane. I told him we had cleared the lane ourselves that morning and that it had been passable since shortly after 9 a.m. He said that was great, that was really something, and then after a brief pause he said he'd noticed that some of his deliveries seemed to be having trouble getting through to his property. He asked if I knew what was going on with access. I told him I wasn't entirely sure who currently had authority over the road. There was a pause. He said he wasn't sure what I meant by that. I told him there was a legal matter pending and that I had assumed he was aware of its practical implications, given that the board had initiated it. I told him I expected the February hearing would produce some clarity. I told him I appreciated the call. He said he'd look into it. The declaratory judgment hearing was February 12th. Our attorney had been building the record since October, and she arrived in court with a document package that was, by any measure, thorough. The core exhibits were the CC&Rs, with the private road exclusion provision highlighted, the lane deed establishing the private right-of-way, the cost-sharing agreement in its most recent notarized form showing 15 years of owner-managed maintenance, and the full correspondence chain between the HOA's counsel and Dell, demonstrating the sequence of letters that had caused the withdrawal of service. Exhibit 14 was the photograph of the laminated cease and desist on the signpost, timestamped 7:03 a.m. on the morning of the blizzard. The HOA's attorney had not seen Exhibit 14 before the hearing. When our attorney introduced it, the HOA's counsel asked for a brief continuance to review the evidence and consult with his client. The judge, a methodical woman in her late 50s who had the bearing of someone who had heard every variation of every property dispute in the county and had a precise sense of when a delay request was substantive and when it was tactical, asked our attorney to explain the exhibit's relevance to the pending action. Our attorney explained that the laminated letter had been placed on the signpost by persons unknown at some point overnight before the storm, and had been presented to a service contractor as grounds for declining a service call during a declared winter weather emergency affecting a medically vulnerable resident. She noted that the HOA's own cease and desist, the document on that sign, had no legal force over the contractor's decision-making, since the HOA had no jurisdiction over the lane. But it had been placed there, publicly, in a manner designed to appear authoritative to a contractor who could not quickly verify its legal status. The HOA's attorney said the exhibit's origin was speculative. The judge said the exhibit's existence was not. She denied the continuance. The ruling came 11 days later. In a 12-page written opinion, the court found that the HOA's CC and Rs unambiguously excluded Sycamore Lane from its jurisdiction, that the exclusion language was specific and deliberately negotiated rather than ambiguous, and that the HOA's communications to Dell constituted misrepresentation of authority that had caused material harm. The cease and desist letters were declared void and without legal effect. The 6 homeowners of Sycamore Lane were confirmed as the exclusive authority over the road's maintenance, access, and service arrangements. 4 sentences in a 12-page document. The rest was explanation. Dell came back on February 6th. He had received a copy of the court's order from our attorney, who had sent it to him as a courtesy notification. He called me the same day. He apologized. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. He had made a rational business decision under conditions that had been engineered to force that decision, and the conditions had now changed. I asked if he was available for the remainder of the winter season and for the following year. He said yes to both. He said he was glad it worked out. The first service call after the ruling was a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of February. A modest storm, 5 to 6 inches overnight, the kind that arrives without ceremony and requires clearing but not excavation. I heard Dell's truck on the lane at 5:30 a.m., the diesel engine at idle, the particular low-frequency resonance it made on the lane's gravel surface, the hollow ring of the blade dropping onto the road at the east entrance. I did not get up. I lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the lane being serviced, which is an ordinary sound. The extraordinariness of it was my own problem, not the sounds. When I walked to my mailbox later that morning, Dell's Pass had left the lane cleared to the gravel on the center line. The margins still had 6 inches of compressed snow, which would need a few freeze-thaw cycles to clear completely. The turnaround loop at Eleanor's end had been done in 2 passes, which is how Dell had always done it. Eleanor's porch light was on. Her Buick was clear. The HOA's March board meeting was held on the 14th, a Thursday evening. 83 homeowners attended, which was the largest attendance in the HOA's 11-year history. This is a notable fact about HOA governance. The machinery of it runs largely on the indifference of people who have other things to do, and it tends to attract attention only when the cost of that indifference becomes concrete and personal. The agenda included a financial review item. The board's treasurer read the legal expenditure figure for the prior year, $14,200. He read it in the same voice he used for all the other figures: the landscaping contract renewal, the community center maintenance budget, the reserve fund contribution, flat, informational. The room's response to that number was the kind of quiet that has a texture to it. 3 board members announced their resignations before the meeting concluded. The reasons given were personal commitments, scheduling conflicts, other priorities. All 3 had been among Harlan's consistent supporters on the road question. The timing of the resignations relative to the financial disclosure was not commented upon by anyone in the room, because it did not need to be. A motion was introduced from the floor, a vote of no confidence in the board president. The motion was non-binding. HOA bylaws do not typically provide a direct mechanism for removing an elected officer mid-term without a full membership recall process. But the vote was held and the result recorded: 41 in favor, 9 opposed. Harlan did not resign. He remained in his seat at the board table through the vote, and through the remainder of the meeting, and through the hallway conversation afterward. He sat in the board chair with his arms crossed over his agenda packet, and his expression arranged into something that was working hard not to be readable. When the meeting ended and people filed out, he was among the last to leave. I did not approach him. There was nothing I had to say to him that had not already been said more effectively by a judge's written order and a room of 41 people. He still lives on Sycamore Lane. His driveway is off the lane's midpoint, second from the east. His grocery deliveries come on Thursdays. His propane truck makes its run every 6 weeks. Everything comes down the same road he spent 2 years and 14,000 of his neighbor's dollars trying to control. In April, I sat on Eleanor's porch on a Saturday afternoon. The weather had returned to something recognizable as spring, the particular raw, tentative warmth of early April in this part of the country, where the sun is back, but the ground hasn't committed yet. Eleanor had made tea. The forsythia along her south fence was fully out, that specific shade of yellow that always looks slightly wrong until you remember it's the first color after a long gray winter, and that's the point of it. We talked about several things before she told me what I think she had been working toward. She asked me first about the court ruling, how it had worked, what the judge had actually decided, whether the HOA could appeal it. I explained the declaratory mechanism, the finding on the CC&Rs, the void status of the cease-and-desist. She listened with the attentiveness she probably brought to 30 years of teaching, not performing attention, but actually holding what was being said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said that she had not understood, until I explained it, that the document protecting the lane had been something we had made ourselves. She had assumed there was a law. She said it was interesting, that there wasn't, that we had done it ourselves. She said that in the weeks before the blizzard, the weeks after Dell had withdrawn his service, and before the declaratory action hearing, she had been quietly looking into senior living communities. Not with urgency, practically, the way she approached most things. She said the road situation had made her feel, for the first time since Gerald died, that she could not reliably get out of her own property when she needed to. She said that feeling had settled into her in a way she hadn't fully named to herself until it was over. She said that the morning of the blizzard, in her daughter's car, watching the lane recede in the side mirror, she had cried the whole drive to the appointment. Not from fear. From something else she said she didn't have a clean word for. She said she had thought about Gerald. She said she thought it was strange, the thing she was most grateful for that morning, that a road was clear. Such an ordinary thing to be grateful for. I did not have anything useful to add to that. I drank my tea. After a while, she asked whether I thought the new board would handle things differently. I said I thought they would be more careful. She said she supposed that was the most you could reasonably expect. I think she was right. What I came back to in the weeks after the ruling was not the court order or the board meeting or even the laminated letter on the signpost, which still sits in a labeled manila folder in my filing cabinet. What I kept returning to was the cost-sharing agreement. The document that ultimately resolved this dispute was not a law. It was not a government regulation or a court order issued in our favor before the fact. It was a written agreement among 6 neighbors, created because a road needed to be maintained, and we were the people responsible for it. It started as a handshake. It became a signed letter. It was notarized eventually because someone's attorney suggested it would be cleaner. We updated it twice when properties changed hands because it needed to reflect who was actually there. These are not heroic acts. They are the ordinary administrative maintenance of a shared thing by people who understand that shared things deteriorate when the people sharing them stop paying attention. Harlan's strategy had depended on us not having done that work. If our maintenance arrangement had remained a pure handshake, undocumented, unwitnessed, informally remembered, his argument about the HOA's jurisdictional authority would have had much more purchase in a courtroom. The document was the defense. We had built it years before we needed it, for no other reason than that it seemed like the right way to manage a shared responsibility. The HOA spent $14,200 arguing against a document we had created ourselves for the cost of a notary's stamp and an hour of an attorney's time. By May, the lane had returned to itself in the way it did every spring, the gravel surface visible again where the last compressed ice had retreated from the shaded section along the north tree line. The ruts and soft spots from winter traffic settling into patterns that told us where the regrading work needed to happen. The trees along both sides had leafed out enough to close the canopy overhead, so that the lane felt like a corridor of its own, distinct and private in the literal sense, a thing that existed independently of the subdivision pressing up against its eastern edge. Eleanor's cat, an elderly orange tabby she called Mr. Fitch, who had survived 11 winters on the basis of indifference to weather and an unshakable territorial confidence, was occupying the top porch step in the late morning sun when I walked past on my way to inspect the drainage ditch on the lane's east side. The ditch had been undercutting the road shoulder for 2 seasons. I had been meaning to address it. I was addressing it. Mr. Fitch watched me pass without moving. I check the ditch twice a year now. I write down what I find, the depth of the undercut, the condition of the culvert at the low point, what the road surface looks like above it. I file the notes in the same folder as the cost-sharing agreement. The folder has a label on the tab that says Sycamore Lane, Maintenance Record. The lane takes care of itself if the people on it take care of it. That is the whole of the lesson, if it is a lesson at all. It is more like a condition. The road was there before any of us arrived, and it will need maintenance after we are gone. And in the meantime, it is ours to manage. We manage it. We,